hopefully we both get there. But I really like that idea, right? What he says is he calls someone who's just perpetually engaged in reflection, he calls them an armchair revolutionary, right? And I cannot be an armchair revolutionary, right? A true revolutionary has implemented all of these elements of praxis, and it's the combination of all of these things that we can officially, properly talk about the concept of praxis. Okay, the next point is very interesting, right? Activism is action without critical reflection, right? So if you call yourself an activist, right? If you say that I'm an activist, and I think I'm an activist, this is a bit of semantics, but I'll grant Freire this conception. He says that activism is action, right? You have action, but you don't have any reflection, right? There is no theory motivating your action. You just act to act. And the activists on this account is they jump from one issue to the next, right? I want to stand for gay rights. I also want to stand for sort of green ecology, sort of world betterment. I also want to stand for, I'm anti-domestic abuse and violence, and I'm this. And this person's all over the place, right? The person isn't steeped in contemplation and reflection and abstract thought, and the person goes from one topic of action to another, right? There isn't really a sense of a true understanding of the cause, the motivation behind these causes, right? If someone says that they're eco-conscious, right? It's like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to have an understanding of the earth, right? The Gaia principle. What does it mean to have an understanding of the earth as inherently, inextricably tied to my own identity, right? What does that mean, right? Once I understand that, coupled with this incentive to act, then I can really talk about being a revolutionary. But if all I have is just the desire to go out there and help, that's great, but that's not good enough, right? You're not going to bring about true change with just the desire. You need more than just the desire to help. You have to be more than just a willing hand. You really need to understand the root causes that propel social change in order to bring about social change. Social change is not brought about by eager participants, right? Social change is brought about by eager participants that are steeped in the abstract theory that motivates, that drives, that fuels the cause. Without the combination of these things and dialogue, critical dialogue is doomed to fail. So he doesn't look kindly, that is, Freire doesn't look kindly on activists. The armchair revolutionary is different, right? So the armchair is just the opposite, right? There is no action, right? But there is lots of reflection, right? So the armchair revolutionary, there's no action. Unlike the activist, the armchair revolutionary, no action at all. I would much rather write this paper. I would much rather read this journal. I'd much rather just watch this video. I understand what it means, and I can see how that would motivate someone to act, but I just don't really want to donate to those children. I'd rather not build that well. I would rather not go protest. I'm not going to go picket. I'm not going to go and put my life on the line, or I'm not going to jeopardize my convenience or my privilege, right? I don't want to, really when it boils down to it, I don't want to inconvenience my privilege. It's one of the main reasons that individuals who are armchair revolutionaries become armchair revolutionaries, because they recognize that to be true revolutionaries, you have to challenge your privilege, right? I have to get out of the comfort of this very nice office and get in the street with people who will never have access to something this nice, and attempt to try and explain very, very abstract, very, very reflective theory to them so that they can recognize on their own account, right? Recognize on their own account, and I watch them and hear them and learn from them so that we both mutually can recognize on our own accounts how we can together transform society, right? Without those two elements, then really all you're doing is you're just steeped in sort of the tradition, the business of education. And the business of education is like any other business model. I don't know why people don't recognize it, right? It's young professors come up, we are all fighting desperately for tenure and promotion, so we write because we have to write, and we publish because we have to publish, right? And we are engaged in causes passionately because we have to be engaged in causes passionately. How many of us are actually in the street, in the fields, you know, in the indigenous populations making changes? Very, very small segment of us. Though I've done some work, I'm far from where I need to be, right? But that's why this whole process for me is a mode of catharsis as well, because I remember, yeah, I got to turn off the camera and go do some work in the field, right? So it's important to recognize that insistence that Freire has. Thus, only through praxis can the objective transformation of reality, the OTR, right? It's only through praxis that we can talk about the objective transformation of reality. And we know what that means. It's just a very technical way of saying sort of the equalization of and the abolishment of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, right? It's no more oppressor, no more oppressed, just people. How do we get to the objective transformation of reality? By engaging in genuine praxis. What is genuine praxis? It is the consolidation of three things. First, reflection, knowing what I'm talking about, understanding the cause, understanding the goal of the cause, understanding the origin of the cause, understanding where the cause is going, engaging in critical dialogue, a discussion with other people, exchanging information, not this fromness where I tell you what the case, but a dual recognition, a dual discussion, a genuine attempt to understand and trust, and then ultimately action after all of these forces. And then once we act in this manner, our action inherently becomes revolutionary. Your action at this level can be nothing other than revolutionary. And that's power. That's super powerful, especially for people who've never had and have always been denied power. Okay. The next segment is the dependency, right, of the oppressed. And this screen is not erasing well. The dependency of the oppressed. I'm actually going to change colors. I think this black is wrong. The dependency of the oppressed. The dependency of the oppressed. What Freire attempts to do in this section is to talk about, which I think is actually pretty profound, how it is that individuals and, by implication, institutions create, manufacture a state of dependency. How do you, and that's the question. That's a powerful sort of research question, right? How do you manufacture, create a state of established dependency, right? How do I create a state in which I have a population who is dependent on whatever resources it is that I might have for their sustenance, right? This is not a curious dependency. This is a genuine dependency, right? How do you create that? How do you create that state of affairs? Well, Freire goes through this process and he says, the first thing that we have to do is that we have to recognize that suffering, pain, anguish, suffering, in its true sense, suffering is a precondition for dependency, right? If we're going to talk about creating a dependent state of affairs, then there has to be some suffering that the oppressed population goes through. And it is in this oppression, right? It is in this suffering, it is in this pain that the oppressed population subordinate themselves, right? It is in this state of suffering that the oppressed population recognize the impoverishment, quote unquote, of its state. It's not a real impoverishment, it's an enforced impoverishment, but there's at least a recognition of the impoverishment of their state. The suffering is a precondition then, right? Suffering, according to Freire, becomes a precondition for dependency. So, if we're going to create the argument, it's suffering leads to dependency. Right? Suffering for Freire leads to dependency. What we recognize, however, is if I am in a state of dependency, right? We talked about this in a previous video. If I'm in a state of dependency, then it's immediately the case that I am in a relationship, an institution, a state of affairs where there is an inherent imbalance of power, right? There's an individual who has power, and then there's an individual who doesn't have power, and I'm waiting for the prescription, whatever the prescription might be, right? There's this idea of fromness, right? It's this idea that the information is going to come from those who have power to me, and I'm going to be the recipient of these instructions, these prescriptions, and he's talked about this, right? Well, if we recognize that this also is the foundation, right? This is the foundation of oppression, or the system of oppression, then among fellow members of oppressed population, and especially among members of sub-oppressed populations, we're going to have horizontal We're going to have horizontal violence, and he talked about horizontal violence. Horizontal violence is just a very fancy way of saying misdirected violence, right? I am really, really pissed at the man, whoever the man happens to be, and the man doesn't have to be a white man, right? It's just whoever's in control, the boogeyman, right? The puppet master, the person with all the control. Whether that person actually exists as an individual or it's an institution, and typically it's an institution. So the institution has objectified me, right, by definition, and we saw how, because there's this inability to share. So the institution has objectified me, and I'm pissed at the institution. But I can't attack the institution, right? I can't attack the man because, in a sense, it's ethereal. It doesn't really exist, per se. So I misdirect all of my hostility towards the institution against members of my community, and that violence that I really need to direct towards the institution is misdirected towards members of the oppressed group, and this is called horizontal violence. So that suffering leads to dependency, and dependency, the state of dependency leads to horizontal violence, right? So suffering leads to dependency, and the dependency then leads to horizontal violence.